Hello again, Jerry back with another Landrace cut. I hope you enjoy. I want to begin this one by talking directly to everyone who's been following the Landrace series from the start, as well as anyone stepping into this chapter for the first time. These deep dives are meant to bring you as close as possible to the real historical and agricultural story behind these plants. Not the marketing version, not the nostalgia-washed version, but the documented, culture-rooted truth. As always, everything you hear today is educational, analytical, and grounded in verifiable history. Nothing here is guidance for use or cultivation, and nothing in this series is meant to encourage activity outside the laws that govern your state, tribe, or country. I'm simply walking you through the lineage, the environment, and the human context that shaped these original cultivars. With that said, Highland Oaxaca Gold isn't a strain you can rush into or summarize in a single sentence. It deserves a deliberate entry point because every part of its story, the landscape, the culture, the altitude, the climate, even the trade routes that once carried it north, shaped how this plant expresses itself. So, before we get technical, before we start talking about its chemical fingerprint or the long-season sativa physiology, we need to step into the highlands themselves. We need to understand the place that allowed this cultivar to exist at all. Oaxaca is not a single landscape. It's a mosaic of steep mountains, high plateaus, deep valleys, and humid lowlands, 11 recognized microregions intersecting across one state. But when people spoke about the legendary Oaxacan, or Oaxaca Gold, during the 1960s and 1970s, they weren't talking about the lowland fields near the coast. They were talking about the mountains, the same mountains shaped by the Zapotec people who refer to themselves as the Cloud People. That name isn't poetic branding, it's a literal reflection of the environment. Clouds roll across these hills at shoulder height, pulling moisture through the air even and in the dry season. Light hits differently up here. Heat disperses differently. Plants stretch differently. Life evolves under a different pressure at 2, 3, 4,000 feet above sea level. This is the world. Highland Oaxaca Gold adapted to long days, unbroken photoperiod cycles near the equator, and a growing season that asks plants to keep reaching, keep stretching, keep producing for months at a time. Unlike the compact, cold-shortened cultivars from Afghanistan or northern latitudes, these Mexican highland sativas were never built for brevity. They were designed by their environment to endure, to maintain energy in thin air, to thrive in steep, terraced soils, to race vertically toward the sun instead of compressing into dense resin-heavy knots. And when you understand the landscape, the plant's behavior stops looking exotic and starts looking logical. An agricultural organism shaped by altitude, humidity, and uninterrupted light. Even the gold reputation so many people remember wasn't cosmetic hype. In these highlands, late-season temperature shifts and intense light exposure brought out golden hues in the drying process, and occasionally light purple tints in certain selections. Those colors became identification marks for quality long before genetics were documented, long before terpene science, and long before the concept of strain existed the way we use it now. To the communities tending these fields, these plants weren't a brand. They were a crop, seasonal, temperamental, respected, and shaped by the land and the people living within it. By the time Highland Oaxaca Gold began moving beyond its place of origin, the plant had already been shaped for generations by altitude, seasonal length, and the agricultural rhythms of the region. What changed during the mid-20th century was not the plant itself, but the forces acting on the communities who grew it and the growing network of trade passing through rural Mexico. The mountains that once kept these cultivars isolated also created natural channels for movement, paths widened by necessity, migration, and commerce. As people traveled, so did their crops, and Highland Oaxaca Gold became one of the cultivars that slipped quietly into the broader economy long before its name meant anything to the outside world. During the 1960s and into the 1970s, the landscape of agricultural export in Mexico was shifting under multiple pressures. modernization projects, expanding road systems, and political attention directed at both legitimate and illicit crops. These changes opened routes that previously served only local trade. The rugged paths and highland passes that once carried maize, coffee, textiles, and artisan goods gradually became conduits for cannabis shipments headed north. This wasn't the result of a sudden boom or a single organized effort. It was a slow accumulation of movement, small loads carried through mountain corridors, handed from one community to the next, gradually forming a predictable pattern. Highland-grown cannabis, with its long flowering cycle and unusually bright, high arousal effects, was particularly valued in these early exchanges because it stood apart from the lower elevation material grown closer to the coast. The plant's architecture worked against rapid export, but favored quality. Its elongated branches, spaced calyxes, and airy floral structure allowed it to dry more evenly in the open air, leaving less moisture trapped inside during the long, hand-tied transport stages. In a period when nearly everything moved as compressed material, Highland sativas often maintained more of their character during the journey than heavier coastal expressions. Growers didn't select for bag appeal as the modern industry understands it. They selected for survival, how well the floral clusters held up through transport, how well the resin endured changes in humidity, and how reliably the plant resisted rot throughout the drying process. Those traits made Highland Oaxaca Gold one of the more resilient, high-elevation exports, even before the U.S. began developing any real vocabulary for differentiating imported flower. By the early 70s, when American demand for sin semilla began rising, Highland Oaxaca Gold started showing up in U.S. cities as part of the broader wave of Mexican gold. This label was never precise. Coastal, mid-elevation, and mountain-grown cultivars were often compressed together, but certain shipments stood out for their color, aroma, and psychoactive profile. Individuals familiar with the networks at the time described the Highland material as immediately recognizable: brighter hue, sharper fragrance, and an effect that broke sharply from the heavier sedative imports coming from other regions. These qualities weren't folklore. They were the predictable chemical output of a long-season, narrow-leaf ecotype exposed to high UV, large diurnal shifts, and continuous uninterrupted flowering without cold-induced stalling. The U.S. market, though unregulated and inconsistent, developed an informal hierarchy. Colombian regions dominated the perception of potency in many circles, but the Mexican highland cultivars carved out their own identity. Highland Oaxaca Gold contributed to this shift because it delivered something that mainstream consumers had almost no frame of reference for: a soaring, fast-onset, thought-scattering effect that hit harder and cleaner than many of the compressed imports circulating at the time. Even in degraded form, after weeks or even months of handling, the flower still carried enough volatile aromatic components to distinguish itself from lower-grade material. Its contribution to early American cannabis identity came not from marketing or myth-making, but from direct experience, an unmistakable, high-arousal profile that people remembered long after the physical flower was gone. As these shipments increased, a new pattern emerged. Growers and collectors who traveled during that era, volunteers, surfers, anthropologists, drifters, and small-time adventurers, began carrying handfuls of seeds back with them. They weren't preserving genetics with any coordinated purpose. They were acting on curiosity, impulse, or simple habit. But those small seed collections became the earliest building blocks for domestic experimentation in the U.S. Because Highland Oaxaca Gold required long flowering seasons and performed best in climates with extended sunlight and high daytime temperatures, it ended up in the hands of growers who were already inclined towards outdoor experimentation. These growers documented traits that American hybrids at the time lacked: the relentless vertical drive, the whiplash headspace, the citrus wood resin, and the refusal to finish before autumn without perfect conditions. Over time, these traits became desirable, something to breed with, refine, or fuse with other long-season cultivars. This is how Highland Oaxaca Gold moved from an agricultural product of the mountains into the lineage of American cannabis history. It wasn't carried forward through corporate infrastructure or large-scale breeding initiatives. It survived because a handful of seeds traveled across borders in pockets, backpacks, and mail envelopes. That accidental migration fed directly into the early foundation for American sativa breeding. When West Coast growers started crossing long-season Mexican stock with Colombian, Thai, and other equatorial varieties, they were inadvertently cementing Highland Oaxaca Gold into the genetic architecture that would later define entire categories of North American sativa expression. Once Highland Oaxaca Gold reached the hands of growers outside its original environment, the plant revealed a behavior pattern that seemed almost contradictory to people accustomed to northern or hybridized genetics. It didn't conform to expectations shaped by compact Afghan cultivars, and it didn't bend to the timing constraints of temperate latitudes. Instead, it expressed the logic of its origin with absolute consistency, making every horticultural decision feel like a negotiation with a biological system that had no interest in compromise. The first point of confusion for many growers was its architecture. Rather than dividing its energy between lateral expansion and early floral development, Highland Oaxaca Gold concentrated its effort on vertical acceleration. Stems elongated with an almost deliberate rhythm. Internodal spacing stretched far beyond what indoor growers considered manageable, and the canopy often lifted itself into zones of higher heat and stronger illumination without showing any sign of stress. This behavior wasn't excess, it was adaptation. In its native highland environment, light intensity remained stable across long seasons, and the plant evolved to take advantage of height as a strategy for maximizing exposure during its uninterrupted photoperiod. The same tendency, when translated into a greenhouse or indoor room, became an immediate challenge for anyone who tried to confine it to a predetermined agricultural grid. Its leaf structure added another layer of complexity. Narrow blades with elongated midribs formed an angled geometry that captured light without trapping humidity, allowing air to pass easily through the canopy. This shape reduced the risk of moisture accumulation during the extended flowering periods the cultivar required. In a climate where evening clouds drifted across the slopes and morning mists clung to the vegetation, leaf architecture acted as a moisture management system rather than an aesthetic trait. When removed from that environment, this same structure produced a plant that almost never behaved like modern hybrids during defoliation, pruning, or training. It responded better to directional guidance than to aggressive removal, and it continued growing as if unconcerned with the expectations of controlled environment agriculture. The flowering sequence illustrated the second major difference between Highland Oaxaca Gold and most modern cultivars. Instead of triggering a rapid transition under shorter photoperiods, it drifted into bloom gradually, building reproductive momentum over many weeks. Calyxes began forming in loose exploratory clusters, never condensing into the dense masses familiar to growers accustomed to indica-derived hybrids. As the cycle progressed, each bud site extended into elongated spears, structures built for consistent airflow and long-duration resin development. Rather than producing weight quickly, the plant allocated energy toward metabolic endurance, maintaining resin formation and aromatic production deep into the life cycle. Early harvests eliminated its defining traits. Full maturity required patience bordering on discipline. Environmental tolerances added a third dimension to its complexity. Highland Oaxaca Gold handled high light intensity with an ease that surprised many growers, yet it reacted sharply to interruptions in its preferred rhythm. Fluctuations in humidity, inconsistent temperature swings, and poorly timed irrigation created cascading delays in the floral sequence. The plant wasn't fragile. Its root systems anchored themselves aggressively, and its stems thickened with a fibrous density, but it maintained an internal clock aligned with the conditions of its origin. Excess nitrogen during early bloom, abrupt changes in airflow, or attempts to force a faster finish all led to elongated flowering times or incomplete resin development. When grown with consistent environmental parameters, however, it demonstrated a stability that reflected centuries of selection under shifting highland weather systems. Chemical expression followed the same internal logic. Highland Oaxaca Gold doesn't concentrate its terpenes early in bloom the way many modern cultivars do. Instead, it accumulates volatile compounds progressively, developing its citrus wood incense fragrance in layered stages. Many early growers misunderstood this staggered development and assumed the plant lacked aromatic intensity, only to discover its full profile near the end of its long maturation window. This timing aligns with the metabolic patterns of tropical and subtropical narrow-leaf cultivars, where terpenoline-dominant and mixed aromatic profiles often reach peak concentration later in the cycle as the plant prepares for reproduction during extended photoperiods. What appeared as delay was simply the natural pacing of a long-season ecotype executing its biological blueprint. Even the way Highland Oaxaca Gold responded to soil reflected the conditions of its home terrain. Mountain soils in its region are often well-drained, moderately fertile, and subject to rapid shifts in moisture. The plant evolved to favor root environments that encourage oxygen exchange and deep penetration, not dense, heavily amended growing media. When placed in rich, high-nutrient soils, it frequently responded with excessive vegetative growth at the expense of floral development. In looser, more breathable substrates, whether native earth or cultivated equivalents, it expressed balanced vigor, strong anchoring, and a steadier transition into reproductive growth. It was not a plant designed for force-fed fertility. It was built for moderation, airflow, and the slow-release nutrient matrices found in its natural environment. What became clear to every grower who worked with it long enough is that Highland Oaxaca Gold did not behave like a plant bred for efficiency. Its physiology demanded time, consistency, and space, and it repaid those conditions with an expression that modern hybrids rarely reproduce. Elongated floral spears that carried their scent deep into the late season, resin that developed in thin atmospheric layers over months, and a chromatic finish influenced by altitude-driven temperature shifts rather than engineered genetics. It was a cultivar that asked growers to match its rhythm rather than imposing theirs onto it. The chemical identity of Highland Oaxaca Gold unfolds in layers that only make sense once you understand how long-season sativas metabolize energy and light. This cultivar doesn't express its aromatic signature early, and it doesn't show its cannabinoid strength through obvious visual cues. Its chemistry matures in a slow, ascending curve, shifting its internal balance as the plant moves deeper into flower. Every stage brings a different metabolic priority, and together, those stages create the psychoactive architecture that made this cultivar stand out decades before modern terpene science existed. The cannabinoid profile is anchored by a dominant THC expression with almost no competing cannabinoids to buffer or soften the experience. Instead of the blended THC-CBD ratios found in some mid-elevation Mexican varieties, this Highland ecotype pushes almost entirely toward a type 1 chemical configuration. The result is a profile where THC takes center stage without the moderating influence of CBD, CBG, or CBC in meaningful quantities. This absence creates a clean, direct pathway for the psychoactive response because nothing within the plant's chemistry is slowing or dampening the receptor-level engagement. It's a formula that magnifies clarity, lifts energy, and accelerates mental tempo rather than guiding it downward or inward. The terpene composition provides the other half of the effect, and with Highland Oaxaca Gold, it follows a pattern consistent with other long-season, narrow-leaf cultivars, shaped by intense sunlight and extended photoperiods. Instead of early surges, the aromatic compounds build density progressively as the plant approaches its final weeks, accumulating volatile molecules at a pace that mirrors its slow physical maturation. Terpenoline often rises to the top in well-preserved samples, reinforced by limonene, alpha-pinene, osamine, and smaller contributions of beta-caryophyllene and floral microterpenes. This combination doesn't produce a sweet or dessert-like aroma. It creates a sharper, brighter spectrum, clean citrus, fractured wood resin, faint herbal edges, and a crisp highland sharpness that reflects its elevation-based evolution. The interaction between the dominant cannabinoids and this terpene ensemble forms the core of the plant's psychoactive identity. Instead of producing the heavy, weighted shift common in indica-leaning or hybrid chemotypes, the effect strikes like a rapid expansion of thought. THC engages the mind quickly when unbuffered, and the surrounding terpene environment amplifies neural stimulation rather than muting it. The early onset creates an immediate sense of mental acceleration, as if the plant removes the usual resistance in the brain's internal circuitry. Terpenoline and limonene reinforce this brightness, lifting mood and speeding cognitive oscillation, while pinene keeps the experience sharp rather than dreamy. Osamine introduces a faint, cooling lift that subtly increases the sensation of airiness, contributing to the highland altitude effect many people described long before these compounds were studied. Because CBD is largely absent, there is nothing to slow the transition between stages of intoxication. The effect expands rather than sinks, building momentum over time instead of plateauing quickly. People who encountered this cultivar during the import era often described losing their grip on linear thought or finding themselves drifting between ideas faster than they could articulate them. That wasn't mythology. It was a chemical profile engineered by its environment to produce a fast, cerebral response that mirrors the metabolic tempo of the plant itself. The absence of sedative terpenes like myrcene in dominant quantities further distances it from modern hybrids, removing the feeling of heaviness or body drop that typically cues the end of a session. Instead, the experience keeps climbing, sometimes to the point of sensory overload if someone underestimated its potency. Another defining element of this chemical framework is the timing of terpene maturity. Highland Oaxaca Gold waits until late in its life cycle to finalize its aromatic composition, which means the psychoactive potency is tied to full ripening. Early harvesting eliminates the depth of its terpene profile and can produce a shallow, jittery experience rather than the smooth, fully extended arc it's capable of. When grown to true maturity, the resin carries a balance of bright volatiles and deeper wood resin undertones that stabilize the effect enough to keep it from becoming chaotic. In this fully developed state, the cultivar delivers a kind of cognitive elevation that feels both energetic and immersive, pushing attention outward rather than pulling it inward. Even the physical sensations reflect this chemical architecture. Instead of a warm heaviness or body melt, there's a heightened awareness of breath, space, and ambient sensation. The mind becomes louder than the body, and thought takes precedence over physical grounding. This separation between cognitive and somatic experience is one of the reasons Highland Oaxaca Gold gained its reputation as spiritual or psychedelic in the 1970s. The effect wasn't hallucinogenic. It was an unfiltered expression of a high THC, terpinolene-driven sativa operating without counterweight. That clarity, speed, and expansion felt otherworldly to consumers used to compressed imports or lower potency material. All of this chemistry, slow terpene maturation, THC dominance, the bright upper spectrum volatiles, and the absence of grounding compounds forms an unbroken chain between the plant's Highlander origins and its impact on early American cannabis perception. What people remembered wasn't just strength. It was the way the experience rearranged their sense of attention and pace, something far removed from the body-heavy hybrids that would later dominate the market. Highland Oaxaca Gold carved out its identity through chemistry that favored altitude, endurance, and clarity. And the result was a psychoactive profile that still stands apart even in a world saturated with modern cultivars. The influence of Highland Oaxaca Gold on early American breeding took shape at a time when growers were still learning the language of cannabis through hands-on experimentation rather than formal science. Instead of laboratory verification, they worked with sensory observation, seasonal timing, and the instinct to combine plants that displayed traits they could feel, but not yet describe. Within that environment, Highland Oaxaca Gold became one of the cultivars that quietly redirected the trajectory of American sativa breeding. It introduced a kind of internal speed and clarity that stood out in a landscape dominated by mid-grade imports and shorter season adaptations. Growers noticed it immediately, not because of yield or structure, but because of the way it shifted mental tempo in a way few other cultivars did. When these early growers began collecting seeds from their favorite imports, they weren't attempting to preserve landraces. They were looking for parental stock that could introduce new dimensions into their own gardens. Highland Oaxaca Gold entered the genetic pool through this informal selection process. Its seeds carried a chemical pattern that amplified cerebral stimulation without dragging the body downward, and that unique combination made it an attractive outcross candidate for breeders searching for something brighter than the Colombian lines and more energetic than the Thai cultivars circulating at the time. Even though those other regions had their own reputations for potency and distinct effects, the Mexican highland material contributed a streamlined psychoactive edge that breeders quickly learned they could work with. As these growers began making their own crosses, certain patterns consistently emerged when Highland Oaxaca Gold was introduced into a pairing. The resulting hybrids often showed sharper mental lift, more electric momentum, and a longer runway before the effect reached its peak. This contrasted with crosses that relied heavily on Colombian inputs, which tended to contribute weight, introspection, and a slower arc. The Highland Mexican genetics cut through that heaviness, introducing an upward trajectory that never settled fully into stillness. Even when crossed with Thai cultivars, known for their expansive and drifting headspace, the Highland Oaxaca influence added structural tension, a kind of internal brightness that pushed the experience forward rather than letting it dissolve into dreamlike dispersion. This is the chemistry that eventually fed into the creation of Haze, one of the most important sativa-dominant lineages in modern cannabis history. During the early developmental period of Haze, breeders worked with a rotating cast of long-season imports. Colombian and Thai genetics formed the structural backbone, but the Mexican contribution, widely associated with Highland Oaxaca Gold, introduced the high-frequency energy that defined the Haze effect. The Colombian inputs shaped the frame, the Thai inputs added complexity and elevation, but the Mexican Highland chemistry sharpened the signal. It delivered the rapid ignition, the crystalline mental edge, and the unmistakable takeoff that distinguished Haze from other long-flowering hybrids of the era. Without the influence of Highland Oaxaca Gold, Haze would have leaned heavier, deeper, and slower. It would have drifted closer to the meditative qualities of a Thai-dominant line, or the grounded introspection typical of Colombian gold types. The inclusion of the Highland Mexican genetic line created a hybrid architecture that behaved differently from both parents, faster in onset, brighter in tone, and more rhythmic in its progression. The cultivar contributed not just cannabinoids and volatiles, but an underlying metabolic trait, an energetic pacing that carried through the lineage even as it evolved into modern hybrid variations. This impact didn't stop with Haze. When Purple Thai emerged through the combination of Chocolate Thai and Highland Oaxaca Gold, another influential doorway opened. This cross carried forward the long-season structure and cerebral lift of both parents, but the addition of the Mexican Highland chemistry refined the experience into something more focused and less meandering. From there, fragments of Highland Oaxaca Gold continued branching into later generations, informing the development of cultivars that would eventually shape the early California and Pacific Northwest scenes. Even growers who never heard the name Highland Oaxaca Gold were working with its descendants, using hybrids that carried its tempo-altering chemistry without knowing the origin of those traits. Modern genetics are too blended to isolate the original influence through phenotype alone, but the signature remains visible in the behavior of certain sativa-forward hybrids that still display rapid psychological ascent, extended mental clarity, and unusually bright aromatic profiles rooted in terpenoline or océamine-driven chemistry. These traits trace back through decades of breeding to a handful of imported seeds carried north by travelers who had no idea they were transporting the foundation of an entire family of effects. The legacy of Highland Oaxaca Gold inside breeding culture is not defined by fame, branding, or market dominance. Its importance lies in how it recalibrated expectations for what a sativa could feel like. Through its contribution to Haze and related lines, it set a new standard for upward-driving psychoactive chemistry and established a template for clarity, speed, and elevation that modern hybrids continue to chase. Its genetic fingerprint is not a relic. It's an active force embedded in the invisible structure of countless cultivars grown today, a quiet architect of the bright, soaring effects that defined an era and still shape consumer experience across the world. The difficulty in preserving true Highland Oaxaca material begins with the simple reality that its survival depended on geographic isolation. The cultivar wasn't protected by policy or heirloom stewardship. It was protected by distance, terrain, and the slow pace of rural agricultural change. Once those barriers eroded, the lineage no longer existed as a stable population. It became exposed to a wave of external influences it was never designed to withstand, and the shift happened faster than most people realized. The first force that destabilized the lineage was the arrival of hybrid seed stock into regions that had previously relied on locally maintained selections. These hybrids were built for shorter seasons, higher yields, and easier harvest timing, practical features for growers under pressure from eradication efforts or shifting economic expectations. When these seeds arrived in the highland valleys, they didn't replace the local genetics all at once. They mixed with them. Pollination events were unregulated, unmonitored, and unintentional. A single season was enough to blur the boundaries between the original ecotype and the imported hybrids. A few more seasons were enough to erase visible distinctions entirely. This erosion wasn't obvious at first. Farmers still saw tall plants with narrow leaves and long flowering windows, and many assumed they were working with the same lineage their families had grown for generations. The problem was that the underlying genetic architecture had shifted. The subtle traits that defined Highland Oaxaca Gold, its timing cues, its subtle growth cadence, its distinct aromatic progression, were diluted by the arrival of faster, denser, and more commercially appealing genetics. Pollination drifted across farms without anyone realizing how quickly the original profile was disappearing. By the time growers recognized the change, the lineage had already fractured into mixed populations, with only faint traces of the original chemistry or structure. Another pressure came from economic volatility. Stability in rural agricultural communities requires alignment between effort and reward, and Highland Oaxaca Gold was never an easy crop. Its long flowering time made it risky in regions facing increased enforcement, unpredictable weather, and fluctuating labor availability. When faster maturing hybrids began circulating, they provided a level of safety that the Highland ecotype couldn't match. A shorter harvest meant fewer encounters with eradication teams. A heavier floral structure meant more weight per seasonal cycle. A denser resin profile promised more consistent returns. Under these pressures, growers who once maintained long-season plants out of cultural continuity began shifting toward hybrids that protected their livelihoods. Preservation wasn't the priority. Survival was. As hybrid influence expanded, the distinctiveness of Highland Oaxaca Gold faded into a diffuse category of local sativas that no longer resembled the original population. The landrace didn't vanish in a dramatic collapse. It thinned out through gradual genetic dilution. What remained in the region were plants that carried vague echoes of the lineage, height, leaf shape, or a faint memory of its original aromatics, but without the coherent genetic structure that once defined it. The cultivar's decline was not a loss of seeds, it was a loss of identity. Once the lineage blurred, even seeds collected from the same region could no longer be trusted to represent the original plant. The remnants that survive today owe their existence not to continuous generational cultivation, but to the habit of travelers and collectors who carried small seed batches out of the region decades ago. Many of these seeds remained dormant in personal collections, forgotten until the rise of modern preservation efforts. When these seeds were finally germinated, growers found themselves working with material that had been frozen in time, snapshots of the lineage as it existed before widespread hybrid contamination. These selections became the foundation for modern S1 lines, open, pollinated heirloom projects, and reconstructed IBLs that attempt to stabilize traits that once held together naturally. Selfed lines, when done carefully, retain a focused slice of the old chemistry and morphology, but they also narrow the genetic window. They preserve distinct traits, but sacrifice the dynamic variability that existed in the original population. Open pollinated heirloom collections capture more variation, but they rely entirely on the quality and authenticity of the original seed lot. Some of these collections originated from seeds carried out in the late 70s, mid-80s, or early 90s by individuals who had no idea they were preserving something that would later collapse in its home region. These collections are uneven, sometimes brilliant, sometimes incomplete, but they remain the closest surviving links to the original Highland material. Reconstructed IBLs represent another approach, the deliberate rebuilding of a lost lineage through repeated selection and stabilization. These projects do not claim to recreate the full original population. Instead, they recover a recognizable expression by emphasizing the traits that defined the cultivar's identity: its prolonged bloom, its upward driving chemistry, its narrow leaf vigor, and its late-stage aromatic development. These reconstructed lines function as living archives, not replicas. They provide growers and historians with a way to interact with the essence of Highland Oaxaca Gold, even when the true landrace has become fragmented beyond recovery. What survives today is not a single intact lineage, but a constellation of partial continuities, seed lots that escaped contamination, S1S built from preserved genetics, heirlooms safeguarded by chance, and modern inbred selections shaped by careful hands. None of these forms represents the entire historical plant, but each preserves a different facet of its identity. Together, they allow the lineage to persist in a world where the original population no longer exists in its unbroken form. What remains is fragile, imperfect, and irreplaceable, the last reflections of a cultivar that once evolved naturally in the mountains and now survives only through the attention of people who understand what has already been lost. In the modern era, Highland Oaxaca Gold exists less as a living agricultural lineage and more as a symbol, an idea that has been reshaped and amplified through layers of memory, marketing, and selective storytelling. Breeders, collectors, and consumers each project something different onto the name, and those projections have built a mythology that often eclipses the fragmented reality of what remains. Where the original plant was defined by environment and community, its current identity is shaped by curiosity, nostalgia, and the gravitational pull of a name that suggests access to a vanished world. For breeders, Highland Oaxaca Gold represents a reference point rather than a functional population. Its reputation carries weight even when the surviving genetic material is inconsistent or incomplete. In an industry where lineage claims influence perception, attaching Oaxacan heritage to a project signals a connection to the early architecture of North American sativa development. Some breeders seek it for its historical importance. Others pursue it for specific traits they hope to extract: long-form clarity, late-stage aromatic shifts, or the bright escalating psychoactivity that once distinguished it from other long-season cultivars. The truth is that most modern breeding work involving this lineage relies on fragments, not foundations. The seed lots used today are often narrow windows into a genetic structure that was once far broader, yet the name retains its currency because breeders understand that cultural resonance can carry a project even when the biological material is fragile. Collectors approach the lineage from a different perspective. For them, Highland Oaxaca Gold functions as a relic, a preserved artifact from a period when cannabis was shaped by regional environments rather than systematic breeding. Seed collectors and archivists often treat the name with a kind of reverence, not because they believe they're holding the full original population, but because they recognize the scarcity of authentic Highland genetics. To these individuals, even partial continuity is worth protecting. The value comes not from market demand, but from the idea of preservation itself, the responsibility to safeguard whatever pieces remain from a lineage that no longer exists in its original form. These collections are often handled with caution, germinated sparingly, and shared selectively among people who value provenance over performance. Consumers exist in a third category altogether. Many who speak about Highland Oaxaca Gold have never encountered a verified expression. They're responding to inherited narratives, secondhand stories, or a cultural memory shaped by media, conversation, and the broader resurgence of interest in landraces. The modern market rewards romantic language, and cultivars with deep historical roots often become inflated symbols of authenticity or lost purity. Highland Oaxaca Gold fits neatly into that mold. It has become shorthand for a bygone era, an uncomplicated past where cannabis came from mountains, fields, and communities instead of indoor rooms and stacked hybridization cycles. That image, even when disconnected from reality, influences how people interpret the lineage today. This nostalgic reinterpretation fuels a cycle where the legend becomes more influential than the plant itself. Old stories are retold with increasing certainty, even when details are speculative or distorted by time. Effects are remembered as transcendent, transformative, or unmatched, descriptions that often reflect the novelty of the era more than the actual chemistry of the original material. In some cases, the lineage becomes a canvas onto which people project their first profound experiences, attributing personal history to a cultivar that may or may not have been the one they actually encountered. This is not deliberate exaggeration. It is the natural way memory reshapes itself around powerful moments. The name survives because the story attached to it feels larger than the plant could ever be on its own. The modern market amplifies this dynamic. As landrace interest grows, seed vendors and brands often frame Highland Oaxaca Gold as a pristine survivor from a mythical past, even when the seeds they offer come from reconstructed or heavily selected lines. The marketing emphasizes heritage, rarity, and authenticity, knowing that consumers crave emotional connection as much as chemical experience. In this environment, the name functions as a signal, a way of asserting that a cultivar stands outside the rapid churn of modern hybridization. But the reality is more complicated. The plant being sold is often a curated echo, an interpretation shaped by the breeder's choices and the limitations of available material. Yet, the market rarely questions this discrepancy because the longing for connection to the past outweighs the desire for genetic precision. These layers of reinterpretation, breeder utility, collector reverence, and consumer nostalgia have transformed Highland Oaxaca Gold into an object of cultural memory rather than a stable genetic identity. Its modern reputation rests on a foundation built as much from absence as from presence. The original population is gone, so the mind fills in the gaps. What survives is a lineage that exists simultaneously as biology and mythology, a plant reconstructed through selective preservation, and a story reconstructed through human longing. Its significance today has less to do with availability and more to do with what people hope it represents, a link to a time when cannabis was shaped by natural pressures instead of market expectations. The name lives on because people keep trying to reach for something that feels deeper than the surface of today's market, something that connects them to a version of cannabis shaped by land, time, and human hands rather than hype cycles. Highland Oaxaca Gold sits in that space between memory and reality, half preserved, half imagined, carrying a weight that comes from more than its genetics. It reminds people that not everything worth understanding can be bought easily or reproduced on demand. Some lineages survive only in fragments, and some stories exist because people refuse to let them disappear entirely. That's where this journey settles, not on certainty, because certainty isn't possible when the plant we're talking about no longer exists the way it once did. Not on nostalgia either, because the goal here isn't to glorify the past, it's to recognize the way history, chemistry, culture, and human instinct all shaped a cultivar that influenced generations even after its original form faded from the mountains that built it. What remains today, those scattered seeds, those carefully tended heirlooms, those reconstructed lines, stands as a reminder that preservation isn't just about genetics. It's about the responsibility to understand the forces that shaped them in the first place. For everyone watching, listening, learning, or researching alongside me, understand that everything covered here is for educational and historical insight only. The goal is to document, to analyze, and to bring clarity to a part of cannabis history that often gets buried under hearsay. Nothing in this series encourages cultivation or use where the law does not allow it, and nothing presented is meant as guidance outside the legal frameworks that govern your state, your tribe, or your country. This is about preserving knowledge, respecting origin, and keeping the record straight for the people who care enough to look beyond rumor. So, as we close this chapter, remember that some cultivars endure through stories as much as through seeds. Highland Oaxaca Gold is one of them. Its lineage may be fractured, but its impact remains intact, carried forward by the people who continue to trace its path with curiosity, respect, and a willingness to understand what it truly represents. And as long as those conversations continue, the plant doesn't disappear. It simply shifts into the form history allows it to take,